Let's think about the square one's name for a second. The square refers to the top and bottom layers being square-shaped. But what if we were to try and make the same puzzle, but with other shapes instead of a square? Consider that the vertical turn on a square one is a deep cut, which means that the cut divides the puzzle into two geometrically equivalent halves. That means that any shape with an odd amount of sides is out of the question, because it cannot be properly deep cut. To explain why, here's the pentagon slice, which obviously has 5-sided faces. If you were to have a deep cut pentagonal prism, the cut would go from here into the middle of this corner. But if you repeat that on all of the faces, that isn't pentagonal geometry anymore, that's decagonal geometry. The cut to pentagon slice is the closest you can get to an actual deep cut while preserving pentagonal geometry, but it just isn't the same. There have been pseudo-deep cut odd-sided puzzles in the past, such as the Hitchhiker's Cube by Twisty Crafts, and Vladimir's Cheese by Oscar van Deventer, but geometrically they just aren't deep cut. So, in making square one variants with different shapes, we're restricted to even-sided variants. There is no two-sided polygon, so the square one is the most basic version of this concept, having 4 sides. If we go to the next even number above 4, we get a 6-sided polygon, which is a hexagon. So I set out to make a Hexagon-1 puzzle, sharing the property from the square one of the corners being exactly twice the size of the edges. So let's take a look at the parts I've 3D printed for it. So if I wanted to make this puzzle the quick and dirty way, what I would have done is simply just had it use a 1x1x2 core, just like a regular square one. But that would have made it so that you would always have to turn the top and bottom layers to that just center slice, and honestly I wanted to put a bit more effort than that into this puzzle, because that's probably a lot of people's least favorite aspect of a square one, so it's like, why not avoid replicating it, you know? So the first step I did was create this fully original Floppy Hexagonal Cheese, which I earlier posted a short about. But basically, this turns on each center slice. There's actually an identical looking puzzle that someone made earlier, and it's right here. But the thing about that one is a single turn only turns 2 of these, and it basically just swaps and flips them. Whereas this, you have 3 of them that cycle around. This design had some minor issues. Sometimes the turns can actually take the screw heads with them if you hold it a certain way, which is not desirable, because just if you know anything about design, you'll know that that's how you get puzzles that either turn terribly or fall apart, or both. Other than that, what's weird is that it's just rubbing a lot. Like, you can see this dust here, and that's just because I guess I didn't lube this puzzle in any way, because the reason why I didn't actually lube it is because if you look here, you can see that this part of the mechanism is like almost on the outside of the cube, and the reason why I didn't lube it is because I didn't want the lube to eventually just get outside the cube and like touch the stickers and just make the puzzle disgusting to touch. So that's why I didn't lube this, but because I'm using this as essentially a base for a different puzzle that'll have an extra layer here and an extra layer here, I will be able to lube it, because then this will no longer be an exterior facing side. So here's the very slightly changed version that I made as a core for my Hexagon-1. What's interesting is that this is also unlubed, and the only real difference in design in the mechanism is that I designed these screw areas better so that there's now no chance of the screw going with the face when the face turns. But what I did is actually, these parts were all printed in a different orientation to the ones here. You can see that here, this is the top and this is the bottom, but here these parts were actually printed sideways, or in this case, for these parts, this was the bottom. and it actually turns a lot more smoothly, which is something that threw me a bit off guard, and I guess it just brings to light that even if you have super small layer heights, the print orientation will still make a difference. But yeah, this actually turns like much smoother than the Floppy Hexagonal Cheese, which I guess is a pleasant surprise. You can see on the outside here, this is my standard mechanism for Square 1 type puzzles. I first developed this mechanism on the Waterfall Cube Ultimate, and then I later utilized it in the Waterfall Cube Supreme. So essentially all three of these puzzles have the exact same mechanism, just a different radii. So I'm actually going to take these parts off right now so that I can put on all of the outer layer ring parts. The only reason I assembled it fully right now is just so that I could see if this turns decently, and it does. So let's just unscrew this, and these three parts now come off. And you can see here kind of the inner mechanism of this, where basically it's just, yeah, so this is an asymmetrical mechanism. Let me quickly grab a different puzzle to show you what I mean. Here we have the Mini Pira Twist by Greg. This is a puzzle that I bought from him several years ago, and I guess I never bothered flipping these two parts around. But this is basically a two-layer version of this puzzle, just in a different shape. You can see that if I put them like this, they have the exact same parts. Now, what's interesting about this is that it exposes a property of this that you might not have thought about. Basically, if you turn this like that, you can see that because this is a deep cut puzzle, you might actually be able to turn it like this. But this can't, because just the mechanism wasn't designed for it, even though the cuts line up. Now, if I were to split this puzzle in half lengthwise like that, it would have the exact same property, because every other piece is actually different. So that means these three pieces are the same and these three are the same, but they're not all the same. And you can see that here. Actually, here's what one of the other types of pieces looks like. You can see it has a foot that hooks into these parts, and these I guess would be the center equivalents that go into the core. I did it this way despite it kind of being a bit of a cut corner, but the reason why I wanted to do it this way is just because it's a lot simpler than making all of the parts identical, and I wasn't really planning to make a two-layer version like this anyway. So in that case, you wouldn't really even be able to tell it externally that the parts are different, because this situation would never come up. So yeah, my basic plan right now is to just lube up these outer rings just a tiny bit, and also put some lube into these intersections, and then what I can do is put on all of the outer ring parts, and then I'll put some outer ring parts on all three of these pieces, and then I'll screw them back into this final screw hole. Yeah, I'm not used to making puzzles with an actual core and actual screws. Like, look at this. This is an actual mechanism and not an extension mod of something. Because, like, yeah, there's nothing I could buy that could be extended to make something like this. Again, if I could have just made this a 1x1x2 type thing, but I wanted this puzzle to be just that much more easy to work with, you know? I'm not going to put any lube onto these 3 last pieces, and that's just because I'd like these outer layers to actually stay on the cube and not fall off, as that would just make the rest of the assembly process a nightmare. Thankfully this hasn't been broken in yet, so I have confidence that these parts, which are actually still fairly tight, will just stay on this part of the cube and not give me any trouble. And then when I break the puzzle in, that other half does have lube, so I assume the lube will spread all around the puzzle and thus make all of the parts turn decently well. To be completely honest with you, I'm not totally certain of where this last edge actually is. I'm gonna go look for it, and if I can find it, I'll just put it in. But if I can't find it and I somehow printed one less than I should have, I'll just quickly get that printed and then resume assembling the puzzle. Okay, thankfully I actually did print the part. It's just I forgot it next to my printer. I guess you can actually kind of see how I printed it. This was the bottom, this was the top, and then there's this tiny little bit of support material that held up this area. Thankfully the angles work out on this little foot, so that I didn't need any support material for that, but this one's at a 90-degree angle, so there was just basically no chance of that. And there the support's removed, very easy to get rid of, just using a blade. And now I think I can finally start reassembling this thing and hoping it doesn't all immediately fall apart, because that would be mildly displeasing, to say the least. Like, something that you don't realize when you first start out making puzzles is your goal is for them to be very tight at the beginning. That way when they break in, it'll all be good. What you don't want is a puzzle to be just right in the first place, and then as you break it in, it gets to be too loose, and then it's like you can't really tighten it depending on your mechanism. So always prefer to just have a tighter setup. Okay, now these plug in kind of on the outside like this. Just make sure that I'm putting the right parts in the right place. I'm not a fan of having to do this sideways, but it's like I don't really think I have a choice because the other side of it's not flat. And then this I gotta make sure I put in the correct way, which is this way. Let's grab the screw, grab the screwdriver, and be very delicate about this whole thing because I don't want to have this thing like fall apart. It's already coming apart a little bit. Like, I don't know why, but for some reason a lot of the puzzles I make are just very awkward to assemble. I guess it's because that's not what I optimized for. But like, even the printing process, like, some of these parts are just pain in the butt to print. Okay, now is this going to reach, or do I need to get a longer screw? I feel it catching, so at least I don't have to grab a 10mm screw. I'm fine with this M3x8. Hope I just don't strip it, because that's what FDM cores are known for doing. Alright, I will break in this puzzle, and then sticker it, and then we'll go outside and see how it turned out. It's been a while since I've made any of my puzzles available. I believe the last one was the Fused Illusion all the way back in August of 2020. I know that at least some people were interested in having the puzzles for themselves, So the Hexagon-1 is available, fully stickered and assembled from the link in the description. You can also get a Floppy Hexagonal Cheese if you want one. In terms of turning, after being broken in, the Hexagon-1 actually turns really smoothly on all of its axes, with the top and bottom layers being somewhat more stiff than the slice moves. This might not seem like a significant issue, and while it doesn't impact the puzzle being fully functional and solvable, it does have potential to make it difficult to turn the outer layers if the slices are misaligned. You'll actually see this show up in my Scramble, where I at one point struggled to get an outer layer turned. Normally what I would have done is tabled the puzzle to flatten it, but obviously I had no table in the sandy pit I filmed in, so it was a bit more difficult to get a grip on. I mainly mention this so that if you're considering getting the puzzle for yourself, you're aware of this fact and aren't surprised by it. I've solved the Hexagon-1 3 times so far, and it's been really fun and interesting to work out a solution for it. Some square one algorithms work, but a lot don't, so I had to figure out which algorithms I could use for what. Even if an algorithm kind of worked, it didn't necessarily have the same effect on the Hexagon-1 that it would have had on a square one. Solving the Hexagon-1 was actually a pretty decent learning experience for myself as well, since I never really bothered learning square one algorithms in the past, but now I know at least a few. So my solve later in the video will be more of a walkthrough type solve, rather than an exploratory solve as many of my previous videos have featured. The reason for this is that an exploratory solve on this puzzle specifically would have made for an incredibly long video, and I still wouldn't really have known what I was doing. After solving the Hexagon-1 3 times on my own, I'd say I have a pretty decent method for it, and I believe explaining my findings while solving the cube a 4th time will make for a significantly more interesting video. I will say, for the first puzzle I've designed in a long time that uses a fully original mechanism, the Hexagon-1 turns really nicely, and this success may encourage me to explore other original mechanisms in the future, rather than doing my best to make everything an extension mod of something else. All that aside though, let's scramble the Hexagon-1. Alright, I believe it is time to start solving the Hexagon-1. This should definitely be quite an interesting experience. So, normally on a square one, the first thing you would do is bring all of the edges next to each other, such as this. And that leaves one face to have only corners on it. And what this allows you to do is to essentially have a predetermined sequence of moves that's easy to remember and brings the cube back to its cubic shape, like this. Now, for reasons I'll explain in just a bit, you can't actually put all of the Hexagon-1's edges on a single face next to each other. So, my goal right now is going to be not to put all of them next to each other, but to put most of them next to each other. And then I'll explain the next steps a bit later. Alright, so I achieved my goal. You can see that all of the edges, except for 2, are on this face, and the last 2 are here. And now I'll explain to you why you can't actually put these 2 edges onto this face with all of the others. So consider the fact that this pair can only be moved by splitting it apart. You can see that this doesn't line up as a cut, and neither does this. Now think about what would happen if a corner replaced these 2 edges, because a corner is, geometrically on this puzzle, equivalent to 2 edges. While it would fit, because you would still have 360 degrees worth of parts on this layer, you couldn't get out of that position, because none of these cuts would line up. The only cut that lines up on this entire face right now is the one that splits these 2 edges directly in half. And, well, this isn't the Hexagon-2, so we can't split any corner directly in half. So that's why it's impossible, and this is the next best thing. So, we can't do exactly the same moveset that we did on the square one to get it back into the hexagonal prism shape, but we can do something that's relatively similar. So the strategy here is to more or less just divide everything evenly. So let's try that out. Now we have 6 and 6. Now we have 4 triplets, and then what we do is actually a bit asymmetrical now. We set this up so that the cut goes through the triplets, and then we set the other side up so that it goes through these cuts without any edges in them. And then you set this up to kind of break up more triplets. That's not how you do that. You have to turn it like that. And now we'll do the same concept where we have no edges in this cut and edges there. And now all we have to do is pair these up correctly. And there we are. We are back in the hexagonal prism shape on the outer layers. And the central layer is not solved, so let's see if we can take a couple seconds and try and at least solve its shape so that it's less annoying to deal with. Let's see, how does this line up? Remember that this central layer is actually a floppy hexagonal cheese and not just a 1x1x2. Alright, we've gotten it into the correct shape, so I honestly think that's good enough for it to not bother me anymore, at the very least. Okay, so This is where I'd say we should probably go ahead and do the first layer corners. These should just be intuitive. I only want to use algorithms for the last layer corners. Alright, so to my knowledge, the first layer corners are now solved. And I guess I unintentionally used yellow as the first layer. Not that it matters that much, I don't think. Okay, so now for white corners, we are going to have to actually use two separate algorithms. Alright, so now that I've solved all of the yellow layer corners, I now need to solve all of the white layer corners. And I've also taken the liberty of solving this central layer again, just because it got a bit messed up while I was doing the yellow layer corners. So I have two algorithms that I use to solve the second layer corners. The first is the cuboid algorithm that leaves the left two corners in place and swaps the right two corners. So here's what the algorithm looks like on a Hexagon-1. So you can see that it leaves in place the front right and the left corners, and it cycles the other four. So this would be a 4 cycle. Now the other algorithm that I use for this step is actually this square one algorithm that swaps the two front corners and leaves the other two in place. So here's how that algorithm looks like on the Hexagon-1. You can see that both of the front corners and the right one are in place, and the other three were cycled. So with the combination of the 3 cycle and 4 cycle, I believe I should be able to solve the second outer layer without any significant issues. So let's take a look at that. And here we are. All of the corners of the Hexagon-1 have been solved, with not an insane amount of difficulty. I still don't have an easy way to swap two corners, whether that's these two or these two, But feel free to try other square one algorithms on your own and see if any of them work. Maybe even modify some that don't work and see if you can get something that way. But as for me, I am done with all of the corner positions, and now I guess I will finish putting the yellow edges on the yellow side and the white edges on the white side. It's actually not too bad on this because there's more parts and more axes, so you actually get more maneuverability. So I believe I should be able to just swap this and swap that, while also swapping the same pair of edges down there. And here we are. All of the edges are on the correct side of the hexagonal prism. And all of the corners are still solved. And of course we messed up the central layer again. Maybe I'll leave it alone for now. But yeah, so now all that's left is to do edge permutations. Now the algorithm I use for the most part is just the basic square one algorithm to swap two pairs of edges. And you can see here that we swapped these two and these two. And that's pretty much what I do on this. However, it's also useful to have a 3-cycle at my disposal. So for that reason, I've also tested out this 3-cycle that cycles the back 3 edges on the square one. And here's how it works on the hexagon one. You can see that it cycles around basically the 3 back edges. So those are the 2 types of edge swaps I'm going to be using to solve the Hexagon-1's edges. Alright, and as you can see, the outer layers have been solved. So, real quick, let me get the inner Floppy Hexagonal Cheese back into position. Okay, and the Floppy Hexagonal Cheese is solved. So overall, it's not that bad. It was just really interesting to have to consider the fact that a lot of square one algorithms either don't work or work differently, and working around that in order to fully solve this cube. Now, in basically all of my previous solves, I did get parity. And that led me to figure out that most parity algorithms for this just flat out don't work on the Hexagon-1. So, because I don't want to leave you out of luck in case you buy one of these and you do get parity, let's quickly take a look at the one parity algorithm on the square one that almost works. I've stopped in the middle of the algorithm at the 2, 0, and you'll notice that what I do next with the 2, 0 is I simply turn this face entirely formulated of corners by one step over, and then I effectively just undo everything that I just did. So that's how this algorithm works. You do a lot of setup moves, and then you turn this a single turn, and then you put everything back. So let's try doing that on the Hexagon-1 real quick. So you can see that instead of only corners on the top layer, we actually have two edges on the top layer. And what we would do, instead of turning it one click over, is actually do a complete 180-degree turn like that. And then we would undo our setup moves, and then two edges would have been swapped. And it's not as simple as it seems. You might think, oh, it's obvious. It's just because you're swapping this edge with this edge when you're doing that move. But that's not really the geometric reason. So real quick, before I end the video, let's quickly go over why the parity algorithm works on the square one, and then why this modified version works on the hexagon one. Okay, so firstly consider that the square 2, which is a square one with all of the corners split exactly in half to have the same overall size as the edges, on that puzzle, you cannot have two swapped edges. This is only a phenomenon of the square 1, and that's because each corner is actually two edges bandaged together geometrically. So the way you have two swapped edges is if you also have two swapped corners. They don't necessarily have to be directly swapped. What matters is the amount of swaps that have to be made. So with that parity algorithm on the square 1, when you make a single turn of this corner only layer, you actually perform the equivalent of 5 swaps. It might be a little difficult to understand at first, but ignore the puzzle's physical capabilities for now. Just think about it if you were able to just swap pieces at will. So when you're turning this layer clockwise, you're swapping 1 to 2, and then 1 is where 2 is. And then 1 to 3, 1 is where 3 is on the diagram. 1 to 4, 1 is where 4 is on the diagram. 1 to 5, 1 to 6, and then you'll have successfully completed enough swaps to complete the single clockwise turn. And you'll see on the right that that's actually 5 swaps, which is an odd amount. So by swapping that, you release the parity, and your edges are essentially no longer swapped. Now let's look at the Hexagon-1. This diagram is a bit more crusty because I modified it from an actual screenshot of the cube, but you can still see that it's the same idea. We have 4 corners on the top, 4 corners on the bottom, and 2 edges on this face, which I've labeled A and B for clarity. And when we make this 180-degree turn that I showed you just now, what you do is you swap 1 to 5, 2 to 6, 3 to 7, 4 to 8, and A to B. And that is again 5 swaps, which is an odd amount. So once again, the edges are swapped, except this time you could say that they're swapped a bit more directly than on the square 1, because on the square 1, the actual swap doesn't even involve any edges. So that's why the parity algorithm works. I hope that makes at least some sense to you. If it doesn't, don't worry about it and just use the parity algorithm to solve the cube. But anyway, that's all I really have to say about the Hexagon-1. Overall, it was really fun for me to figure out how to solve it, and I've enjoyed making this video quite a lot. If you want one, link's in the description below, but be mindful that it's sometimes useful to table it in order to get these layers to turn more easily. Thank you all very much for watching, and have a good day.